Thank you, Nick. Nick's explained what I used to do, so I'm sort of coming back to what I did before in a sense, but I will be explaining the WTO, and some of you may already know about the WTO, so forgive me if I tell you things that you already know, but maybe from a slightly different point of view. But what I was specifically asked to talk about was the World Trade Organization in relation to Brexit. And the short answer to that is the World Trade Organization is caught up in a war in Brexit. It's not the first time the World Trade Organization has been caught up in a war. I have the T-shirt to prove it. There was a ministerial conference in 1999 which turned into a movie some of you may even have seen. I didn't dare. It would just bring nightmares back to me. But the difference between that war and the war we have here over Brexit is that that was a war against the WTO, whereas what's happening with Brexit is that the WTO has become a weapon between two different groups of people. So the leavers and the remainers throw ideas about Brexit at each other, sometimes quite false. Sometimes people justify the incorrect things that they say. I'm trying to be very careful in case I'm prosecuted. By saying, we've been to the WTO, we talked to some people in Geneva at the WTO, and therefore you can trust what I tell you because I've met them and this is what they said. And here you've got two examples of leavers and remainers who came back from the WTO and completely exaggerated, to put it mildly, what the WTO told them or what they learned from the WTO. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is because some leavers, like Patrick Minford, believe that there's nothing wrong with leaving the European Union without a deal, because you then fall back on WTO rules, they say that's fine. The WTO is a basic agreement that can apply in the case of no deal between the UK and the EU. Well, when leavers say that, the remainers then go around and say, no, it's the opposite of being free. Countries do trade deals to escape the WTO. Well, I'm sorry, if you're a member of the WTO, you can't escape the WTO. Everything you do comes under WTO rules, as we shall see. So let's start off with a little bit of the truth. What is the WTO? I like to describe the WTO as an elephant, the elephant that the proverbial 6 blind men came across, and each of them touched different bits of it and thought it was something different. It was a rope if they got hold of the tail, or it was a banana tree trunk if it was a leg, and so on. Because in a sense, that's how a lot of people look at the WTO. The lawyers will focus only on dispute settlement because that's litigation. And because dispute settlement's in trouble, they say the WTO is about to die. Some journalists will look at negotiations and judge whether the WTO is working or not based on whether the negotiations are going well or not. My answer is all 4 legs are important. The WTO does not stand on one leg. So what are these 4 legs? The first leg is negotiations. This is the beginning of everything that happens in the WTO. Everything comes from negotiations. It's done by the members, agreed by consensus, and there are rules. We've had now, since 1947, negotiations periodically, right up to now, and including now, that have led to a rules-based system and gradually lowering trade barriers, 2 key aspects of what the WTO has achieved. And we have $20 trillion of trade in goods and services that flows around the world at the moment, almost unnoticed in terms of being newsworthy or not, as a result of those negotiations. When you've signed an agreement, that's not the end of the story. You want to know you've got obligations that you've got to implement, and you want to know that other countries are keeping their promises and complying by the agreements. So the second leg, implementation and monitoring, I would say is perhaps the most important leg of the WTO in its day-to-day work. but it's unnoticed. Journalists are not interested in it. It's deadly boring and dull. You get new chemicals regulations that are notified to the WTO, and other members look at them and say, well, our chemical industry can handle this or can't handle it, but it's not something that hits the headlines, but it happens every day. If you look at an organigram of the WTO, it consists entirely of meetings. It's only committees, hierarchies of committees dealing with implementation and monitoring. Some of them do other things, but the majority of them do that. If you look at the schedule of meetings in the WTO, it's meetings mainly about implementing. And that's a really important part of the WTO's work, which I don't think we should forget. Part of that job in implementation is for countries to discuss, to raise issues with each other if they don't like the new chemical regulations, the REACH rules of the EU, some of you may have heard of. Then they can discuss them, okay? They can try and find a solution, a way around it. So what that does is that it actually avoids litigation, and it's only a handful of issues that get beyond that, that then come to dispute settlement. Now, this leg really is in trouble. Dispute settlement has two parts. It has the first ruling by what are called panels. That's okay for now. And then you have an appeal stage, and it's the appeal stage that's in trouble. Some of you may know already. There are normally 7 appeals judges. The United States has blocked the reappointment or replacement of those judges. We're now down to 3 because they've been blocked. That's the minimum number of appellate body members who can hear an appeal. At the end of this year, there'll be 1 left, and then there can be no appeals. And that means if China appeals the case that it lost against the US, ironically, on agricultural subsidies, then that case will just stop. And the US will not get to the enforcement stage of a case that it's won. Yes, this leg is limping very badly, but it doesn't mean that the WTO elephant will die just because of that. The 4th leg is about development. The WTO is not a development agency, but there are rules that are more lenient for developing countries. They're designed to help developing countries perform in trade. And they also, the WTO is basically a meeting place for all of this stuff and includes allowing donors and recipients to get together so that development assistance can be tailored better to allow developing countries participate in trade. So that's basically the functions of the WTO very much in summary. But I also talked at the beginning about negotiations and agreements, and I think it's important when we look at Brexit to understand that there are actually 2 sets of outcomes of negotiations. This is the agreement that was signed by then 120 countries in Marrakesh in April 1994 to set up the WTO, to take over from what was previously the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And there are 2 parts to this. One part is the rule book, which is over on the left. It's 500 pages. It covers a lot of substance. It's goods, services, intellectual property, and within goods you've got agriculture, anti-dumping, product standards. In services you've got financial services, telecommunications, and so on. So there's a lot in those 500 pages. So that's the rule-making part of the negotiations. The rest of it, 20,000 pages, is lists of commitments that countries have made as a result of the negotiations. And basically, this is about agreeing to lower trade barriers. So much of that are tariff ceilings. The European Union's commitment on certain types of shoes is to lower its tariff down to 8% and not go above 8%. So it's a ceiling, but it could unilaterally go below 8% if it wanted to. And that's also the UK's commitment because the UK is an EU member. Which brings me to the question of, is the UK a member of the WTO? Because a lot of people out there are still confused. And the answer is yes, it is. The United Kingdom was an original signatory of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It joined the European Union. And when the WTO was set up here, a UK minister also signed on behalf of the United Kingdom. the WTO now has 29 European Union members. The 28 member states plus the European Union itself. So that rule book, 500 pages, applied, continues to apply to the UK in the EU and after it leaves the EU. That doesn't change. What may need sorting out is the schedules of commitments of the European Union, that's part of that big pile of paper on the right. Because at the moment, EU member states' commitments are bound up in the EU's own schedules of commitments. And by and large, extracting what applies to the UK is fairly straightforward. If the EU's tariff ceiling on shoes, on some types of shoes, is 8%, the UK says, well, we'll stick to 8% as our committed ceiling in the WTO. You may have seen stories about whether the UK is going to go duty-free on everything after Brexit or not. That I would interpret as being a unilateral step that just goes below the ceiling in the WTO. The ceiling in the WTO will stay at 8%, but the shoes, actual tariffs charged on shoes could go down to 0 if that's what they want. By and large, either a direct copy and paste or some technical conversion, for example, for market access for services and so on, that can be done fairly straightforwardly. It's time-consuming, but it can be done. The tariffs in the goods schedule, the schedule that deals with goods, tariffs cover about 680 pages out of 700 plus. There are 25 pages within that that are really difficult, and there's something called tariff quotas. And tariff quotas are where a country says that it will import a certain quantity, either duty-free or at very low duty, but anything outside that quantity is charged a much higher duty. For example, the European Union's tariff quota for sheep meat is 0% for around 300,000 tons, of which 200,000 tons comes from New Zealand, is allocated to New Zealand. Question, that's the EU 28. When they split UK and EU 27, how much would the tariff quota for the UK be? How much would the tariff quota for the EU be? Well, it's fairly complicated. They took a long time, the UK and the EU, to try and sort out, to reach agreement on how they would do that split. They reached agreement, they submitted their proposal to the WTO, they had the data, submitted it to other countries, but other countries said, well, look, for the tariffs, maybe we're not that concerned, but for tariff quotas, we really are. And for example, New Zealand says, well, we don't agree with the way you're splitting our 200,000 tons between the UK and the EU. I won't go into details here, we can follow up later, but the point is, the United Kingdom, because of the length of time taken to do all of this, the United Kingdom eventually said, okay, we agree this is going to be a negotiation. And that step was taken on December the 21st last year. And that meant that they had a 3-month period for countries to formally raise objections under the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that 3-month means that that comes to an end on March the 19th. So the negotiation phase begins on March the 21st. I think you all know what happens, or is supposed to happen, within a few days of March the 21st. The short answer is this is not going to be, the tariff quota bit is not going to be sorted out by Brexit Day, if Brexit Day is March the 29th. Does that mean they can't trade? Not necessarily. There are ways around it. The EU doesn't have certified schedules. The EU has spent a lot of time trying to sort out tariff quotas for its enlargement from 25 to 28 to whatever. So it's possible to be practical, and the hope is that everybody will be practical, even though there may be objections and the tariff quotas may be tweaked later. We're not talking about trade coming to a halt because these tariff quotas are not sorted out. There is good news. Good news is that for services, which are also have a lot of commitments, very complicated commitments that I don't really understand, because they are so varied. Services are, professional services and banking and telecoms are all very different and have different rules. But all the objections to, or reservations about the UK's proposals have been dropped, except from Russia. So there's only one country left that they need to negotiate with to get the services deal done. And on government procurement, that's through. it's up to the UK now to ratify that, tell the WTO, and for the government procurement agreement, which actually is the only one the UK actually has to accede to, that by and large is done. It's in the UK's hands. Remember, this system allows $20 trillion of goods and services to be traded annually, almost all of it without anybody making any comment or objection, because it all flows smoothly. It's a rules-based system. It means that this is not operating in the law of the jungle. And there are certain rules that are very important. Non-discrimination is one that I'm going to come back to. And there are two types of non-discrimination. One is this famous MFN, most favored nation, which means that you have to treat your trading partners equally. So when the European Union cut its import duty for non-members from whatever it was down to 8%, it had to apply that to all other WTO members equally. So that's equal treatment. There's also national treatment. If you give your own authors copyright protection under certain laws, in theory, you're supposed to do the same for nationals of other countries as well. But there are lots of exceptions. And the other important part about this rules-based system is what I've already mentioned, that second leg, the transparency, stability, and predictability that it provides to the system through the system of notification. Information gets shared, people are able to comment, and there's peer review. But the one I'm going to focus on is MFN, because that's the one that seems to be coming up a lot in terms of Brexit, because it means the question is this. Well, let's give you an extreme example. Some people have said, including Tony Abbott, former Australian Prime Minister, said that it's fine, you leave, you don't have an agreement with the European Union, you just don't charge tariffs on products from the European Union. You continue to give them duty-free. This statement astonished me, because if that were to happen, and the UK weren't to do the same, i.e. duty-free imports from the US, China, Australia, and so on, Tony Abbott's government would be the first in the queue to complain that the United Kingdom was violating MFN. It was favoring the European Union without a free trade agreement. So what about no deal in WTO terms? I think that one point I would make is definitely I can predict with total confidence that it won't be the end of the world. I can also predict with a degree of confidence that it won't be the same for everybody. Some people may even thrive in a situation of no deal. There are people who can step into, who are agile and can step in and benefit, but there are some people who will be hit hard. And I think that's a fairly important point to remember, that the impacts of no deal will not be spread evenly throughout the economy. The other thing that I would say is, because people quite often say, well, look, the US and China and Australia and so on trade with the European Union without a free trade agreement, they're doing very well indeed. And my answer to that is, if the UK had never joined the EU, the UK would probably do well trading outside the EU and not necessarily having a free trade agreement, although I think that the natural way economies work, the UK would have a free trade agreement with its closest big economy, but that's another matter. The point is this. It's the change of direction from an economy that is directed towards the European Union and turning it around the way you have difficulty when you're turning a supertanker around, because it's going in one direction, it has this huge momentum. And that it's that is going to cause the disruption. If the UK and the EU were to end up with no deal after 15 years, the impact wouldn't be so much. If they end up with no deal on March the 30th, the impact will be immense. Why? There are a lot of reasons. I'm going to stick to tariffs. Be aware that for many products, tariffs are not the biggest deal. It's things like compatibility of standards and regulations and all of that, and also their services, which is not part of this goods thing. This thing on the right that you can't read is a tariff profile of the European Union from the WTO website. So it gives you average tariffs, it gives you average tariffs for different categories of products. But on the left, I've highlighted some numbers. And people will say to you, some people will say to you, look, the average European Union tariff is about 4%. For agriculture, it's about 10%. That's not very high. If those tariffs go up between the UK and the EU, then it's not such a big deal. But that's not looking at the detail. Averages hide detail. If you actually look at individual product groups, the highest tariff on one type of dairy product is 190%. Somebody who's exporting that product to the EU duty-free and suddenly confronts a tariff of 190% is going to lose that market. Now, I have no idea what that product is, and I'll show you in a minute why I have no idea what it is. But you can see that there are fruit and vegetables that go up to 181. There are fish, there are peaks at 26%, and transport equipment, the peak is 22%. That one I could look up. It's certain types of trucks. You can see from this, if you can just about read it, if you can't read it, let me explain. This comes from the Agriculture and Horticultural Development Board. And the point is that tariffs are very complicated for agricultural products. For example, for fresh chilled beef, boneless, there are two components. The first part of the tariff is 12.8% of the price, and the second part is 303.4 euros per 100 kilos. And if you want to make that a percent of the price, you have to know what the price is. And if you don't know the price, then you can't do it. But thankfully, this group do. So they calculated that actually comes to 65% for beef. And for lamb, sheep meat, it's 45 to 51%. I'm moving on quickly. Dairy products, the highest is milk and cream is 74%. You've got a range from 40 to 70-something percent. That is a big bill, a big barrier that exporters would have to face if they're trying to export through normal tariffs to the European Union. Remember, at the moment, it's duty-free. So, finally, the magical Article 24 that some of you may have come across. I would like you to try and, if you have come across it and heard about it, try and put yourself in the position of me and some of my colleagues who come to this from a completely different angle and are completely puzzled by how this ever came up. Remember, we have this non-discrimination rule. You're not supposed to discriminate between your trading partners. So how come Canada and the US can trade duty-free with each other but not with the rest of the world? The answer is because there's a tool called GATT Article 24. GATT Article 24 is a provision that deals with trading goods that allows countries to set up free trade agreements with each other. This is how we understand it. If you're going to set up a free trade agreement, it has to comply with GATT Article 24. So if somebody says we want to use GATT Article 24, what they're saying is we want a free trade agreement in goods that complies with WTO regulations, WTO rules, conditions. It could be anything. It could be one sheet of paper that says all duties between us and the EU are going to be 0%. The last interim agreement that the European Union notified to the WTO was 1,100 pages long. The single market, the parts of the single market that deal with goods come under GATT Article 24. The withdrawal agreement would have to comply with GATT Article 24. The backstop would have to comply with GATT Article 24. So why are people saying, if there's no deal, we will use GATT Article 24? Because a deal means you're using GATT Article 24. Here's an MEP. Suddenly, GATT Article 24 has been an emergency piece of glass that you break in the event of no deal. What nonsense is this? Article 24 is not about failed deals. It's about deals, and you cannot break the glass unless you've got an agreement. So I remind you, if people say we want to use GATT Article 24, what they're saying is we want a free trade agreement in goods that complies with WTO rules. Before I end, they've also said the WTO is keen to facilitate the use of GATT Article 24. Of course it is. It's its job. Its second leg is sharing information and allowing people to comment. So this is what happens when you have a deal under GATT Article 24. First step, UK, EU, strike a deal. How long is that going to take? What does it contain? I leave that to you. But it's not going to be a single sheet of paper, I promise you. What they then do is they notify to the WTO that they have reached an agreement. And that notification is like this. It's a single sheet of paper. So this is how the WTO Secretariat facilitates this. They take this sheet of paper, they check it. Is it formatted correctly? Does it cite the right article? Has it got a link to the actual agreement? Because the European Union submitted this, and they're very experienced at doing it, my guess is that my former colleagues looked at it for 5 seconds and said, fine, and they put it in the system. Now, we do have a bureaucratic system, so you can't send these out in 5 minutes. It may take 24 hours, but that's as long as it takes. And then the information goes into a database. And then WTO members exercise their right to ask the parties to the free trade agreement, what are you doing? Why? Do you have this? What does this provision mean? Et cetera, et cetera. There are Q&As, and that's the end. That's it. Except something called an interim agreement, which is the ultimate magic for no deal, which some people like, because if you have an interim agreement in the WTO, you have to do it in 10 years. And they think, oh, well, this is great. This means that we have a time limit on this. So we can have a very basic free trade agreement, then we go Canada plus, plus, plus after 10 years. Doesn't make sense. Both of those are Article 24 agreements. Either they comply with Article 24 or they don't. So I will leave you with this notion. Oh, by the way, this is an example of that second leg, as I said. This is what happens in the WTO all the time. Information is shared, people exercise their right to ask questions and proceed if they want. If they really think that this is illegal, then they can go to dispute settlement, but that's not happened with many free trade agreements. So that's just one example where WTO rules underpin all trade relations amongst WTO members. It's not a case of either or. You don't have a deal with the European Union in order to escape the WTO. You have a free trade agreement that complies with WTO rules. You set standards for your products that comply with the criteria of standards in the WTO. That's short and sweet. It's only the tip of the iceberg, but I'm now open to questions from the floor. I think Nick asked you to identify yourselves and so on, and wait for the microphone. It's a bit like question time, isn't it? You had your hand up first.
My name is Charles Spencer. I can't attest to any affiliations, I'm afraid. And I apologize, it's an extraordinarily simple question. The slide you've just shown us showed all 29 EU signatories individually.
Yes.
Do we remain bound, whether there's a deal or not, on the 1st of April, as a signatory of that deal with Zimbabwe, Seychelles, Maldives, Mauritius?
I don't think you do. It depends on, because that's what Liam Fox calls rolling over agreements. And it really depends on those other countries whether they would accept rolling it over, but it would in the end be a separate deal with the UK, just as Switzerland has now agreed on an agreement that would partially roll over the deal that it has with the EU. Yes.
Thank you. Katy Harrison from Comres. Thinking of the poll at the beginning, what do you think the public think a no-deal Brexit is?
I've read different interpretations of that poll. Can I say that I'm really glad that I live in a pretty village called Coppe outside Geneva, and I've no idea what's happening here in the UK.
Thank you indeed. Alan Grayson, I'll describe myself as a retired shipmaster. I've been at the front end of trade. Believe me, trade goes on regardless, even where there's sanctions, UN, or even embargoes. Trade goes on. And notwithstanding commodities in all the ships like iron ore, cars, oil, grain, whatever, container ships, which I've served on, many containers, goods being shipped within the EU, outside the EU, all mixed on the same ship, including transshipment through other ports, and it's all dealt with perfectly well electronically now. Given the fact that this is happening now, do you envisage, therefore, any necessary changes that would need to be made with regard to documentation of such goods, other than perhaps an extra one line?
This is not my area of expertise. This is quite technical about how customs and other border procedures are handled. I'm told that it might change because the UK is a third country, and the documentation that third countries need is different from the documentation that is used internally in the EU, but I'm told. I don't know.
Robert Moreland, I'm actually a former member of the European Parliament and was on the Commission's Observatory on the Internal Market. So my question, obviously, is you've talked a lot about tariffs. What about the non-tariff barriers, which, of course, I was brought up to believe were far more important and a problem? Where do they fit in?
How important they are depends on the tariffs, in a sense. Because when tariffs are very high, it's the tariffs that are the main obstacle. But as tariffs come down, one of my colleagues who did sanitary phytosanitary measures was the secretary of the Sanitary Phytosanitary Measures Committee in the WTO. Her explanation was, when the tide comes down, you see the rocks. So the tariffs are like the tide going down, and then and when they're high, they are the biggest obstacle. When they go down, then it's the others that become obstacles. So yes, sanitary phytosanitary measures, food safety, animal and plant health, all sorts of safety regulations and labeling in what we call technical barriers to trade, all of that is going to be very, very important. It's much more difficult to generalize about those in the same way that it's difficult to generalize about services, because with tariffs you can pick a number and it's fairly easy to understand. But yes, they're going to be a problem.
But outside of WTO's jurisdiction?
Outside the... Countries can sign away their rights under the WTO, but the WTO's jurisdiction, the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures Agreement and the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement will always be there. And basically what they say is, if you're going to have these regulations, they should be disciplined so that they are not arbitrary. So for example, for food safety and animal and plant health, either you use an accepted international standard set by FAO, WHO, Codex, OIE, whatever, those organizations that deal with that. Either you use an accepted international standard, or you have scientific justification, which can be risk. And as you know, there seems to be a divergence about how risk is treated, even within WTO agreements, by the US, where the emphasis is on science, and where in the EU, where the precautionary principle, safety first, seems to be more important. The WTO agreements seem to accommodate both in a way, perhaps uncomfortably, but that's there. So what that means is that whether or not the UK and the EU have agreements on these standards, they will have to comply first with WTO agreements, but secondly, they may go beyond that and say, well, we recognize your testing or your standards or whatever. It's a sort of mutual recognition and all of that kind of thing.
Richard Currie, UPS. Just a comment and a question, if I may. as the person who asked about whether there would be customs declarations in the event of a no agreement outcome, yes, there will be, and they would come in overnight. How each side is going to handle them is slightly different, but we've been told that there will be electronic, and they would want to have them in advance of movement. But the complication and the degree of difficulty it's not like switching off one switch and switching on another. It's actually far more complicated than that. So there is a fair bit of work involved. My question is, with there being possibly one judge at the WTO left at the end of this year, won't that just lead to paralysis? And doesn't it send out a message to people that they can do what they want when they want, and there'll be no comeback?
Firstly, thank you for the information. I don't have it, so I appreciate that. It does send out a bad message, but countries are trying to get around it. There have been a number of proposals. The EU has a proposal. Canada has got together a group that they call the Ottawa Group that are trying to do this. There are a number of ideas. One, of course, is to try and persuade the Americans. There are certain things that they can do legally, which I won't go into now, but we can later if you want. There are grievances that the Americans have, but they haven't said if those grievances are addressed, then they will start agreeing to appoint new appellate body judges. So we don't know if that will work. There are other alternatives, like some kind of arbitration whereby you may not have an appeal stage, or you agree that there's an appeal stage, but it's all voluntary and it's not strictly the way dispute settlement happens, but it's some kind of ad hoc process that would allow disputes to be settled. Those are ideas that are all being floated at the moment, but we don't know what's going to happen. I believe the New Zealand ambassador to the WTO is trying to get ideas together and sort that out, so we'll have to see what happens.
Thank you. Simon Harris, Chatham House member, and I was at Seattle in 1999.
Did you get the T-shirt?
The FBI got me through the lines, so I was very grateful. Just for the sake of clarification, my view is that the UK, in terms of its own tariff book, has to have an EBA arrangement and ought to have a GSP arrangement. Could you confirm that my understanding is right and I'm not gone mad? And then there's a proper question. The US has rightly raised the issue of special and differential treatment, which is being applied absurdly when a country like South Korea is still a developing country. This is a nonsense, and the US is right to raise it. But what are the chances of doing anything about it?
Okay, EBA, for those of you who don't know, is everything but arms. There was a decision in the WTO, I think at a ministerial conference, at least one, where they agreed that developed countries and developing countries who are in a position to do so should give duty-free, quota-free access to products from least developed countries. And you said, does the UK have to? Have to in the WTO means, is there an agreement that the UK would violate if it didn't do it? And the answer is no. On the other hand, I would say it has a moral obligation to, and as far as I understand it, that's the intention anyway. It's going to do that. GSP is preferences for developing countries in general. Again, I understand the UK, from what I hear or read in the press in my little village out in Switzerland, the intention is to continue with preferences for developing countries. And you had a third point? Special and differential. This is a very difficult issue, and it's not just the US. The EU also wants to change how developing countries are treated, and there are a number of proposals. It's going to be very, very difficult because the politics of the WTO has for many years been that developing countries, even if their interests may clash considerably, and they do, that they don't want to be divided into separate groups. So India and China and Zimbabwe and so on, would in general try and stay together and not allow themselves to be divided. There are a number of ways it might happen. I'm not good at predicting, so I'm not going to say whether it will or won't happen. One of the ways of doing it is something that came up in a recent agreement called the Trade Facilitation Agreement, where developing countries were allowed to make commitments depending on how they felt they were able to do it. So in something like that, a country like South Korea would probably make a lot of commitments on trade facilitation. And some others would say, well, we would like to do this, but we don't have the resources. Can you give us aid to help us do it? And that some people see this as the future of trade agreements and how they will deal with developing countries. So it doesn't say developed countries do it in 5 years, developing countries do it in 10 years. It's much more subtle than that now. And maybe that's the way things will move. And so one of the ideas was if you were to offer that to China, they might do it without having to recategorize themselves as being an advanced developing country, for example. So you keep the semblance of unity, but you actually make different commitments. It's possible. I'm not predicting anything. Some more ladies. In the absence of.
Hello, Brunello Rosa from Rosa and Roubini Associates. If I understand correctly, in case of no deal, the UK will remain part of the WTO, but it might need to renegotiate the schedules of commitments, and that is a process that takes time. So 2 questions. First question, is this negotiation happening between the UK and all the other member states, and has any of them a veto power? Second question is, if the UK has to renegotiate the schedule of commitments, would it be fair to say that the day after no deal is not true really that the UK falls into WTO, but maybe falls below WTO status?
I don't think it's possible to fall below WTO status. When you said all member states, you mean member states of the WTO?
WTO, yeah.
The rules are actually quite complicated. So you're right, countries' rights to negotiate with the UK, and remember, I sort of skimmed over this, but they're actually negotiating separately with the EU as well, because the EU has to adapt its own tariff quotas. So specifically on the tariff quotas, which are the area where they're going to be sticking points, there are rights written into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which say certain countries have the right to negotiate. They are principal suppliers, or they were the countries that originally negotiated this. Quite clearly, if a quota is only for New Zealand, New Zealand is going to be the only country to negotiate with the UK and the EU. But if there are quotas that are open to everybody, then it is the countries that are supplied through that can do that. In the end, a country can still, even if it's not one of these, it can still block. China blocked the certification. The process is certification. When everybody's objections are dropped, then the WTO Director General can certify these as being the correct schedules, and they're legally, they have legal strength. China blocked the certification of one stage of the European Union's expansion, its schedules for its expansion, on the grounds that the European Union didn't recognize its negotiating rights in that. So it became a matter of principle about whether China had the right to negotiate or not. Even while that schedule was not certified, the EU continued to trade. So yes, everybody has a veto because it has to be, all objections have to be dropped. But even if they're not certified, the trade can still continue. Unless somebody brings a dispute, in which case there may be disruption. And China did, and actually, I think it lost that case. So at the moment, it doesn't look as though UK trade would be disrupted. But you never know. You never know. Here first, and then.
Hi, Eduardo Plimpton from Debevoise and Plimpton. So I've got two quick questions. One is, looking back, do you have any examples of basically two WTO members that were either part of one sort of economic area and divided up, and what happened to them, or alternatively, that had Article 24 compliant agreements that went much beyond a sort of normal trade agreement and also covered the non-tariff barriers that the gentleman was alluding to, and sort of when they finally moved away from that and reverted to, you know, basically not having an Article 24 compliant agreement, what happened to their respective economies? And secondly, another aspect that we've not really sort of talked about tonight in terms of WTO and Brexit is this idea of the UK taking charge and sort of leading a WTO renaissance of a new round. I mean, to me, as a layman, it seems improbable, but I wanted to hear your opinion.
But there is no real example. The closest example was when Czechoslovakia split. They formed a customs union. That was Article 24. Then they joined the single market. So that's, I mean, you go back a lot further. People talk about when some of the British colonies got independence and so on. I'm too young. I'm sorry. I don't know.
Anita Punwani, Risk Advisor. You touched on attitude to risk as part of your discussion on standards in the US and Europe. We've had scare stories about chlorinated chicken and GM crops. My question was really in terms of the four legs of the elephant, is it really that there's a stage before that any country really has to set its own attitude to taking that sort of risk before it enters into those negotiations, and there's a lot of groundwork before it reaches the first leg of the negotiations?
The ground rules are the WTO's ground rules. There is one very important case where the European Union's precautionary principle was shown to violate WTO agreements, and it's the hormone beef case, if you know about it. The European Union basically said, if it didn't say publicly, it said in private, this is a political problem, we just cannot accept this. And so they haven't accepted imports of beef with hormones and continue to be in violation. Now, would that have been solved if TTIP had been negotiated? Could the UK, the EU and the US? We can all guess. I suspect if it's politically difficult within the EU, then it would still be even within TTIP. And chlorinated chicken would be the same. I'm not aware that there's been a case where the US has said this is a violation of WTO agreements. So I don't know. I forgot to answer another of your questions, which was about UK leadership. In general, I would say this, just as a sort of matter of principle for any country. One, if you want to be a leader in the WTO, you have to have a trade policy. Two, the WTO is full of leaders. There's a group of agricultural traders called the Cairns Group, which is sort of what the UK aspires to be, a sort of free trader, although the UK has this sort of schizophrenia like the EU, where there's a lot of protectionism in agriculture, but you would also like to export freely. And the Cairns Group itself has a lot of leaders, including Australia, so I'm not sure that they would take kindly to the EU suddenly going in and saying, well, now we're going to lead the agricultural liberalization movement. I mean, you win friends in the WTO by actually making good proposals that people like. And those proposals normally mean you giving up something, some of your red lines as well. I mean, that's how breakthroughs have happened in the past in the WTO. The EU had some red lines for many years that were blocking things, and then it sort of said, okay, well, we'll move on this, and that happened. Yes, the other thing is, the EU is at the top tier in the WTO at the moment. The UK is at the top tier in the WTO at the moment. The top tier in the last few ministerial conferences consists of the US, China, Brazil, India, and the European Union. And the UK is in there. When the UK leaves the EU, as I said, I don't often predict, but I'm willing to predict that the UK will not be in that group of 5. But there's another layer lower down, Australia, Canada, Japan, Switzerland, and so on. There's nothing wrong with being there. Just don't have aspirations that you're going to lead the world. You will be another middle tier power.
We can get one more question. That was actually a really brilliant place to end the year.
John Bishop, Chatham House member. When I was operating as an investment strategist just along the square a long time ago, I spent quite a lot of time around here with Deanne Julius, no less, talking about the Uruguay round, and at least that left me with some concept that trade negotiations can be very lengthy and complicated. And obviously, the UK leaving the EU and trying to sign up trade agreements all over the place isn't quite the degree of complication of an overall trade round, but it does seem to me that it's going to take a very long time in many cases before there is actually anything that can be presented to GATT. Am I on the right track there, do you think?
Yes, but it's not just GATT because I mean, I've spoken about GATT because that's what's come up and it's trade and goods, but there's also GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, so it's services as well.
I should have said WTO.
Yes. Yes. The point is what kind of agreement does the UK want with the EU and the EU want with the UK? The single market is much bigger and deeper than the Uruguay round. It's maybe just between 28 countries, but the level of integration in there is huge. Now, if the UK and the EU want something close to that, Norway, heaven forbid, Switzerland, whatever model you pick, it's going to be big. You could say, okay, we'll copy XYZ rules, but then if you say, well, the ECJ mustn't come in and whatever else, then you start tinkering with that, then you're getting into a very, very large exercise. So I would agree with you, it will take a long time. But if you're going for this one-pager, which some people seem to be advocating, just no tariffs and forget about rules and regulations and services and so on, yeah, that could be done quickly, except I doubt if the European Union would agree.
Okay, and on that point, I think we will finish. Drinks upstairs, as I said, but before we go, please, a big round of applause for Peter.